Hello everyone, welcome to JS Gigs, and my name is Deepak. Here in this tutorial, we're going to be talking about dependency injection and service creation in Angular 17, which is a very important topic, right? So there's hardly any application you would find in this world which is written on Angular and does not really reuse services. So services is a very important topic, and it revolves around the design pattern of software engineering, which is dependency injection, right? So let's just quickly go to the VS Code and I'll explain you while as I write the code. Here in the VS Code, as we can see that we have essentially two modules. The first is the auth module. The second is the dashboard module. Here in the auth module, you can see that I've already defined a service, which is an auth service, and it's not so super complex at this moment. So we had earlier written this in a tutorial and I had not explained it. So let me just take some time and explain you this right now. So here in this service, as you would notice that here I have defined an @injector, right? And then I also have I've defined this @injectable, right? So and I've also taken it from Angular core and some RxJS operator and observable and off. Let us just focus on injectable for now, and then we'll speak about what RxJS and RxJS operators are all about, right? So firstly, we are going to be importing an injectable that's basically from the core, and inside the injectable, you may notice that I've provided a property called providedIn as root, right? So whenever you define anything like this, so what Angular essentially does is that it takes a service and then provides that in the root injector. There is a very important concept in Angular called injector, right? So injector is essentially maintained at the root level and as well as at the component level and on the module level as well. So when an application, whenever you do this provided in root, what it does is that it creates an instance of the service at the root level and share that with all the other services, components, directives, pipes, and everything, right? So your component essentially will have a singleton service, and this service would be created at the root level and would be shared. The instance of it would be shared with all the other components further on, right? So, as I said, the injector is basically created at the root level and as well as the individual module and component level. But then, since we have provided it as a root, which means this is a singleton for the entire app, meaning the single instance of it would be shared by all the services, components, pipes, directives, and everything else that you can possibly imagine under the umbrella of Angular 17, right? But then let's say if I do not do this, if I would not have provided the provided in over here and then injected that in a particular component on a module, then the same instance would be available for that particular module or component and further to its all other children module or components. Injectable is That's why injectable is a very important property, right? So I think I think it's pretty much clear for you. It should be pretty much clear for you that what injectable is all about and how injector works in Angular. So let me just quickly repeat it. Injector, as I said, injector is shared at the root level, and then you can also define injectable at at component or module level. And whenever you define that injectable provided as a root, meaning a single instance would be shared with all the other components and module. In case if you define that in a particular feature module, then in that case, that feature module and all its children will have the same instance. If you provide the particular service injected at a component level, then that component and all the other dependency in the component which you may have provided it while creating a standalone component would have the same instance of it. And if you do not, and if assume that your component is a leaf component, and if you have injected this particular service in that component, then each of those components, let's assume that you have done that for three other components, and all the other three components will have different instances of this particular service, right? But that will be just like scoped inside that component. That's why it's very important. You can basically use at the rate injectable decorator to create singleton services for a module or a component, right? So that's why it's very important. And we basically create these service also to share the data. As I said, that sometimes we can create a singleton one, and if you have multiple different components being rendered on your web page and you want to share the data, then using the services also is one of the very prominent option. And we do that often in Angular application that we would see in the next tutorial. But for now, let's just focus on injectable. So now I'm going to be doing is that creating another service here at the dashboard module level. We can do is like we can just probably create a file like this, and let's say dashboard service.ts. So now we are going to be creating a service, right? So in order to create I can basically copy the content from auth service and put it here in the dashboard service. There is a command line utility also available in order to create such services. Like you can write down ng new and then service name and it will create one. But then I find copy pasting is slightly easier, so I'm doing it this way, right? So here's the auth service. Let me change the name of it as dashboard service, right? So, and then dashboard service, I don't think so I need any of it code. So let me remove, or let me just leave those here as is, right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be basically creating this service in order to access the APIs, right? So whenever we need to access the APIs are hosted on the HTTP protocol, right? And in order to access those, we basically need a dependency at which is available at the rate of Angular common HTTP, and that is a HTTP client. Using the HTTP client, we make use of one of its method called get post. You can use any one of its method available. I'm going to be precisely using the get. So you would have to basically call the get method, and then once you once you use the get method, you can provide the address of your API, and then that address that the data would be available in the service, right? So as I said, firstly, we need to have the HTTP client available here. So let me just import this quickly over here. So import from, and then at the rate Angular /common/ HTTP, right? And then I'm going to be importing the HTTP client here. So HTTP client, right? We just save this. And now another important point. In Angular, whenever you need to import a dependency, you basically create a constructor and you provide and you define that here. So I'm going to be making this as private HTTP client. So Angular has something called Injector that keeps a track of all the dependencies required for your components. And whenever the component makes such request to receive an instance of it, like in this case, at the line number 13, what I'm essentially doing is I'm trying to have the HTTP from HTTP client. It sends an instance of HTTP client here, right? And then the HTTP will now have an instance of HTTP client that will be available across the app, across this component to be used. So now let me say call get students record, and it will return observable, and that observable could be of any type, and then this dot http dot get. And now we are going to be basically making use of the API that we have created in Macoon. So if you remember, it was /API /students first, right? Students, let me correct this spelling, right? Similarly, we're going to be creating an API for the other two. We're going to be creating a handler for the other two APIs that we have defined in Macoon. The other one is students details record, and then the other one is students address. A quick correction. I have written class here instead of a call. So excuse me for this. Let me just correct this. CALL, right? So call get students record, call get student details record, and call get student address records, right? And now I'm going to be inputting the API names between the quotes. So the first one is students. The second one is API. The first API is API students. The other one is students detail, right? So let me open. Okay, so student details gonna be API /details. Let me just put this here. forward slash here. Now the other one is address records. So this is going to be API forward slash addresses. Yep. I think it should be good now. So we have basically created a dashboard service, and in that dashboard service, I have created 3 methods. All these 3 methods gather information from the API that I've hosted locally using my code, and I'm going to be using this in my templates and in my components. So first thing first, so let me just use get students records. Let me close everything, and now I'm going to be opening this component. So this is the component which is going to be calling the students record API. So need to inject this service here, private dashboard service, put service here. The Angular has already input this here, but I also need to make an entry here in the dashboard module because I want this service to be shared across the dashboard module. I'll come down here. I'll have to provide an entry in the providers array. So providers, and then there's dashboard service, right? So this entry is made. Let's go back to the component we have, and in the dashboard service, I'm going to be initiating this in the input on ng on init, right? So ng on init is a lifecycle method of Angular, and whenever we implement any of the lifecycle, we implement the interface. We also need to ensure that we implement appropriate interface for this. In this case, it's going to be on init and ng on init. I've decided already. And this dot dashboard service dot get students record dot subscribe. Since this is an observable, so we need to subscribe to it. And now we need to put this in the record. So students is the record that we have been so far using in order to display the results. So we need to now replace this with the actual data. Now we need response any. Now the students will have this response available over here. So let me delete this completely and put us. And also I'm going to be putting an exclamation mark over here. So exclamation mark here in the properties defines that the students may not be initially defined at the time of declaring a class or inside a constructor. It is going to be being defining later. In our case, it's being defined in the ng on init. So that's why I've declared this was an exclamation mark over here. And then we can declare this inside, declare this here, and then assign its value on ng on it, which is one of the lifecycle method of Angular. So this is done. Let us also include the other services and other different components where they are used. The next service I'm going to be talking about is student details records. The student details record is going to be on the list, right? So landing page, and here is the students record component. So let me get an instance of a service here. Dashboard service here, and inside this dashboard service, I'm going to be calling this inside the on init. Again, I have not declared any of the lifecycle method over here. But then I think now it's the time that we implement this. Implements on init, and the moment you declare it over here, it'll be imported right here, right? So now you can see there is a red underline on the students record component. If you hover over it, you would realize that it says that one of the method is not implemented, and that is ng on init, because now you have implemented it but not really implemented a method. So let me declare that as well, ng on init void, and this dot dashboard service dot. Now I'm going to be call student details record. So here, and this is is going to be getting inside a subscribe method. Here I'm just going to be making it as res and any type. Here this dot API response equals to response, right? And if you like, you can actually console log the response here just to see if things are proper or not. So let's just put this console log, and then we will remove it a little while later, right? So let's just put this here as students record components, and let's save this. I think this is also correct now. Well, let's just go to the other service. We have another service defined in dashboard service, which is about the students' marks. And so I think we have defined everything required for this service and component. Now the last change that we need to do is here at the dashboard module, we also need to import the HTTP client module in the import section over here. So let me just put this client module, put a comma over here. The idea of putting the client module in here is that because we are also going to be using HTTP client, which is part of the HTTP client module, and needs to have in the parent or the module level dependency. So Injector is going to be having a copy of HTTP client module, using which it will generate the HTTP client instance, something that we have received in the components to make the HTTP calls in each of those components respectively, right? So two services we have defined, we have done this. Now there is another change. If you notice that our APIs are hosted on 3002 port, and whereas our application is running at 4200 port. So if we need to make two different ports communicate with one another, we actually need to do the course setting. So you can do the course setting at the Macoon level and also at the app level. So normally what we do is this is my personal preference, is that I usually prefer to have a proxy config file like this. So what you can do is you can create a proxy.conf.json over here, and then you will have to define a rule. The rule says that any URL that starts with /API needs to have a target HTTP localhost 3002. And if you remember, while defining the Macoon APIs, I briefly spoke about this. So I said that there is a reason for me to define /API, and this reason for that was to provide a configuration proxy to write the APIs with /API as a prefix, was to proxy them from the Angular application. So proxy.conf.json, you need to define this. The target and secure has to be false because we are not rendering it on HTTPS. And once you define this, just need to open package.json. Here at the start, you will have to define a flag which determines that it is going to be using a proxy. So proxy hyphen config, and then we will have to define the proxy file. So the proxy file name in our case is proxy.conf.json, right? So we just put this here, config, and then proxy hyphen conf.json. It has to be exactly the name that you provide at the root level. It's proxy.conf.json, similar to this, proxy.conf.json. Save this, you will have to restart your application. So let me kill. And now I need to provide a command npm run start, press enter, and there you go. Let's just wait for it to build. And once this built, we will quickly go to the Chrome browser and see if our application is working well enough or not. Right. The idea here is that on the lending page and as well as on the students record page, we need to see the data. The data is something that we have generated from the Macoun that we have seen in the previous lecture. And we are going to be seeing the data on the UI, and that is something which is going to be coming from the HTTP client and HTTP port 3002. So yep, we can see the application has successfully compiled. Let's just go to the Chrome and see if we can access the application. So here is our application. Let us just restart it. Just click on login. Waits for a moment and then we reach here. So now this record is coming from the HTTP port. So let me just close this bit and see if we have all. Let's focus on fetch. You can see this. We have generated a response successfully, and that's basically coming from here. Proxy file, what it essentially done is it had masked the other endpoint and ensure that we see localhost 4200 to render the data. So all this record is basically coming from the API at this moment. The API which we had defined using the Macoun. After this is done, let's just move to the students record. And here also you can see the student detail API is rendered correctly, and it has 27 different records. Something that we had also noticed that we were generating different record at different bulk. So yeah, the third tab we are still yet to build, and that's something that we're going to be building when I tell you about the inter-component communication and communication between multiple components. So I think so far so good. We have successfully created the landing page and the students page, and the APIs are also working correctly, and we have also seen that your proxy file works as it is expected to work, right?